Now that I've completed a painting from a distant viewpoint, giving an overall image of the town, I'm eager to look at Leigh Old Town in more detail. Here we are at the Crooked Billet. From here you can take a delightful walk along the whole length of the narrow High Street. Even though so many of the old buildings have gone, the atmosphere of the ancient fishing village remains. The narrowness of the High Street itself makes it friendly. The irregularity of the buildings, the clutter of roofs and the odd corners keep us guessing what's coming next. And always the little alleys, the passageways and the glimpses of boats and the sea. By choosing this viewpoint of the Crooked Billet, I can hint at the narrowness and the intimacy of the High Street, and also show the tower of St Clement's Church and the steep hill up from the old town. We even catch a glimpse of the houses stacked up and clinging to the hillside. Earlier I explored the High Street and was lucky enough to have the best possible guide and companion, Sheila Pitt Stanley, President of the Leigh Society. We started our tour from the furthest end of the High Street from the Crooked Billet at Bell Wharf. Sheila explained to me that this was originally called King's Strand. The name changed with so many other things in Leigh Old Town with the coming of the railway. The old Bell public house had to be pulled down and the rubble was used to make the new wharf.
And so this is actually made from rubble.
When it was first planned, the railway was to have missed the old town altogether, rising up across Belton Hills to a point near the junction of Glendale Gardens and Elm Road. They even built an access road to the proposed station. They called it, not unsurprisingly, Station Road. However, Station Road was never to lead to a station. The proposed route for the railway was judged to be too costly to build, and so in 1854 the track was laid along the bottom of the hill, slap bang through the middle of the old town. Many historic and lovely old buildings were demolished to make way for it, and several properties were literally cut in two. The original Leigh railway station is the building by Bell Wharf, which is now used by the Leigh-on-Sea Sailing Club. The present station at the foot of Belton Hills was built in 1933. By the 1870s, just 15 years after the railway was opened, 6,000 passengers a day were being carried on a busy line, and as the only way across the tracks for wheeled vehicles was by level crossings, the disruption to the old town was considerable. Since she was a child, Sheila Pitt Stanley has collected stories about her beloved Leigh, listening to the tales told by the Meddles, the Osbornes, the Deals and the Thorpes, and all the other famous Leigh families. We had now crossed Victoria Wharf, where the carcass of a great whale had been landed in 1890. For many people it was the first time they had been that close to a real whale. The enterprising fishermen charged visitors twopence a time to come and look at it, but it soon became a health hazard, and before it stunk the whole town out, it was buried by the Ray Gut. Victoria Wharf is also where Widow Moore, the sea witch, sat. We shall be hearing more about her later. Every building, passageway, doorway and window has a story to tell. Sheila told me about the high tide mark on the wall of the Strand tea rooms. It's just a simple mark on a wall, but to anyone who remembers the 31st of January 1953 and the 1st of February, which was a Sunday, this mark means much, much more. This was the night of the dreadful East Coast floods, which brought death and destruction to the Essex coast, and in particular to the Thames estuary, Canvey Island and the lowlands beside the river. As it began to get dark on that winter Saturday afternoon, the wind, already strong, began to strengthen. It was going to be a very stormy night. The best plan was to hurry home, close tightly the doors and windows, stoke up the fire and stay in the warm. But the force and direction of the wind conspired with the exceptionally high tide to create the worst flood disaster the East Coast had ever known. At dozens of points along the coast and up the river, dikes and sea walls were breached by the relentless sea. Upriver, beyond Canvey, Mobil Oil's brand new refinery had come on stream for the first time that very day. As the cry "flood" went up, quick-thinking engineers shut down the plant in 15 minutes flat, averting an unimaginable disaster. As the last switch was thrown, the water level across the plant had already reached a depth of 3 feet. On Canvey, people were awoken by the sounds of the storm as it became more violent. The speed of the advancing flood of water was beyond belief. By the time many people were out of bed, the water was already halfway up their stairs. Everywhere was pitch black, and the sound of the water and the storm was deafening. On that night and throughout the next day, Sunday the 1st of February, the emergency services and many ordinary people became heroes, facing the full force of nature time and time again to save their neighbours. Leigh Marshes, the High Street in the Old Town, and the wharfs saw the deepest floods ever recorded. In all, 119 people in Essex lost their lives, 50 on Canvey alone, and many more lives would never be the same. But there have always been floods in the estuary. The great midday tide of the 1st of November 1921 is well recorded in photographs and newspaper articles of the time. Ironically, the summer of 1921 was one of the hottest and driest on record, and there was a real concern that the timber-dry countryside at harvest time was only a spark away from disaster. Reservoirs were at an all-time low level, and the country was desperate for water. Nature, in its perverse way, brought the wrong type of water in abundance to Leigh in November. While the adults contemplate the cost to repair the damage and the disruption to their businesses and lives, the children at least seem to enjoy the novelty of a paddle in the high street. My tour with Sheila brought us to Alley Dock. Alley Dock is among a labyrinth of passageways and doorways between the high street and the water. This is where the smugglers spirited away their contraband and loaded their ponies for their nocturnal journeys to Dawes Heath. Local folk would, no doubt, advise their children to "watch the wall, my darlings, while the gentlemen go by." My painting of the Crooked Billet is progressing nicely. Even though renovated over the years and beautified in the modern manner with hanging flower baskets and fancy lighting, the billet still retains some of its old world charm. Old pictures show it as a much more utilitarian establishment. There would certainly have not been a carpet on the floor, and it would have had fewer of the comforts we expect these days. In the distant past, it shared this end of the high street with the coal hole, which jutted out at right angles to the billet across where the road now is. How wonderful it would be to go back to that time and eavesdrop on the conversations in these ancient drinking and socialising establishments in the old town. One of Leigh's truly remarkable characters was a regular at the billet. He was Biffy Wilder. Biffy Wilder was born without legs, and he propelled himself around the town on a 3-wheeled platform, using the handle of a sculling oar in a way that a punter uses a pole. Biffy's family first came to Leigh in 1620, hoping to join the Pilgrim Fathers on their voyage to the New World. But local fishermen convinced them that the Mayflower wasn't up to the hazardous journey across the Atlantic. The Wilder family settled in Leigh, and by the time that Biffy was born, they were regarded as true Leighmen. He lived alone in a cottage on the Strand, and worked on the wharf and around the town. One evening, Biffy was sitting in the billet at his favourite table. It was in the bay window, and from it he could watch all the comings and goings on the busy billet wharf. His usual drinking friends arrived, and soon they were laughing and enjoying one another's good company and far-fetched yarns. From the corner of his eye, Biffy saw a smartly turned-out military officer and a group of soldiers coming along the street. When they reached the billet, they mounted the steps and came in. Once inside, it became clear that this was a recruiting officer. He made his way to the centre of the room, where he grabbed a chair and stood on it. "Righto, my likely lads," he said with a sugary smile. "Who will join up with us in the British Army and take the sovereign shilling?" It was perhaps a little optimistic for an army recruiting officer to expect volunteers for the army from a seafaring town like Leigh, and the Leighmen did little to disguise their contempt as they turned their backs and continued their conversations. "I'll ask you once more," shouted the officer, with the same result. But just as he was about to leave, a quiet, clear voice piped up. "I'll take your shilling." It was Biffy Wilder. You could have heard a pin drop. The officer couldn't believe his luck. "Good man," he said. "Here's your shilling." Biffy reached out and took the shilling, which he then flicked to the landlord, saying with a chuckle, "Drinks for all my friends." As Biffy and his friends finished their pints, the officer ordered his troop to fall in and line up. "You too," he ordered Biffy. "You're in the army now." Grinning broadly, Biffy gripped the edge of the table, and with an almighty effort, the legless man vaulted over the top and landed at the officer's feet. With an exaggerated salute, he said, "Private Wilder, reporting for duty, sir." The entire bar exploded with mirth, and the embarrassed officer beat a hasty retreat out of the billet and marched his men along the high street, with the roars of laughter of the Leighmen ringing in his ears. With so many stories at her fingertips, it's not surprising that Sheila Pitt Stanley is a favourite with the children. A story they love to hear time and time again is the story of the Sea Witch.
Now, children, I'm going to tell you about a lady that was called the Sea Witch. Her name was Sarah Moore. She lived on Victoria Wharf. She would sit on Victoria Wharf. She would hold her apron out to the fishermen as they passed by in the creek and say, "Buy a fair wind, laddie, buy a fair wind." If they tossed her a coin, they had a good day's fishing. If not, the fish didn't run, the nets tangled. It was a warm spring day in 1852. Mrs. Hayes and Mrs. Lungley were busy mending their husbands' nets outside their cottage in the old town. Their children, Lizzie and Janie Hay, and Emily and Rosalie Lungley, were playing in an alleyway not far from Victoria Wharf. They didn't notice a door open when Mother Moore emerged. "Oh gosh, it's the Sea Witch," said Janie. Old Mother Moore glared at the children as she passed. "Clear out on it," she hissed. "Play round your own yard." Before the children could move, she was out of sight. It was the banging of the door that drew the children's attention to the fact that Mother Moore had not bolted her front door, and it was blowing back and forth in the wind. The children were overcome with curiosity as they approached the cottage. They peered in the filthy window, and on the far side of the squalid room came the glow from the copper that bubbled in an eerie, sinister way. In the middle of the room stood an unscrubbed deal table bearing a half-finished meal, a candlestick. From the far end of the room, a wooden matchboarded partition enclosed the stairs. On it was a lamp shelf containing a lamp and a couple of dozen dusty, dirty bottles. "I wonder what she's a-brewing in her copper," said Emily. "Let's go in and have a look." "No, we daren't," said Lizzie. "Oh, come on," said Janie Hay. "Look at them bottles up there. One of them might be a cure for warts and chilblains." "You think so?" said Lizzie. "Mum's poor hands are covered with chilblains. It does make her work so painful and slow." Janie cautiously pushed the door open. The four of them stepped into the cottage. Once inside, Lizzie closed the door. Across the room, the only light coming from the dirty window, Lizzie lit the candle from the fire to inspect the bottles more closely. Emily and Janie lifted the lid of the copper, while Lizzie, with little Rosie close by her side, raised the candle towards the shelf. At that moment, from outside, came the shuffle of feet, and a hand clicked the latch. All four fled in terror to the farthest point of the room, colliding with a bump against the partition. The bottles above shook and clattered over, spilling the greasy contents of one all over Lizzie and Rosie, who were immediately below. Rosie cried out and Lizzie clasped her in her arms. Rosie clutched desperately, tipping the candle towards her wet dress. The door burst open, and with a rush of wind, there stood the angry sea witch, with curses on her twisted lips. At the same instant, Lizzie's soaked dress burst into flames. The children screamed and rushed to the door. Old Mother Moore grabbed her sack and ran towards them, but they were more afraid of her than they were of the fire. They dashed through the door and down the alley towards the creek. The screams brought parents and neighbours out from their houses to witness this nightmare scene. A strong wind fed the flames until the screams subsided, leaving the sobbing of Emily, Janie and the seagulls crying overhead. Doctor and the constable and Mr. Thorpe, the undertaker, were sent for. When they questioned Janie, she lifted her tear-stained face and pointed an accusing finger to the back of the crowd. "She did it," she screamed. "She did it. The sea witch. She came in the door and a spark splashed from her eyes and they burst into flames. She did it. I saw her do it. They burst into flames." The people turned around in anger, but the old Mother Moore was nowhere to be seen. Emily's explanations, however, between sobs were more rational. She shook her head sadly, with tears streaming down her face. She said in a quiet voice, "That stuff what fell off the shelf must have been paraffin. Some splashed on my sleeve. You can still smell it." Rosie got scared when it fell on her, and getting into Lizzie's arms, she knocked the candle against her. And when the witch came in, it made it blaze. "No, no," protested Jamie. "It was the sparks in her eyes. I seen it." There," consoled the doctor. "Perhaps you saw the reflection of the flames in her eyes. It was dark, and it all happened so quickly, didn't it?" "No, I was there. I seen it. She did," sobbed the grief-stricken child. "And she tried to catch 'em with a sack." "Yes, she did," agreed Emily. "She rushed at them with her old sack and she tried to catch 'em." There were many Leigh folk who chose to believe Janie's story and handed it down from their children to grandchildren. It made a far better story to say the sea witch had power to flash sparks from her eyes and kill people with fire. But I always maintain she wasn't trying to harm them with that sack. She was trying to suppress the flames and save the children. So at least I give her credit for that. You know?
The Leigh Heritage Centre is the ideal place for storytelling, but I'm telling a story of my own at the Crooked Billet, a story with watercolours. Incidentally, the circle of flagstones arranged round the anchor are the original steps from the Strand Wharf, which led down from Richard Chester's house. Once again, having decided that a picture is finished, let's drop it into a mount and put a frame round it.